Meriwether Lewis was born in 1774 near Ivy, Virginia. He enrolled in the Virginia militia where he ended up meeting Clark. Lewis grew up with Jefferson, which led to them becoming good friends in the future. After the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson needed an explorer to draw a map of the landscape as well as document the wildlife in the West. This included new species of plants and animals as well as different tribes of Native Americans. Lewis asked Clark to be his sideman in his adventure.
Lewis and Clark, along with a crew of men, brought supplies that would have to last them multiple years, seeing as though they had no idea how long it would take them. These supplies included keelboats, clothing, food, rifles, as well as ammunition, tobacco, cloth, alcohol, medical supplies, as well as many other supplies that they would use in order to trade with the native.
At Fort Kaskaskia, Illinois, Lewis and Clark recruited 12 men from the troop station there. They also hired Francois Labiche, an expert boatman, Indian trader, and interpreter. Half French, half Omaha, Labiche became an enlisted and valuable member of the expedition. To help move their boats upstream against the powerful Missouri River current, the captains hired French boatmen. These engages came to Illinois from France, Canada, or New Orleans. Some were born on the Illinois frontier, some were of Native American descent. They were experienced trappers and tradesmen, familiar with the dangers the journey would bring. After spending the winter with the expedition in the Mandan villages of present-day North Dakota, most of the engages returned home, bringing letters, journals, plants and animals, and news of the expedition with them.
They left from the fort where they sailed to St. Louis, Missouri, and on May 14, 1804, they began their expedition to the Pacific Ocean. When they met the Yankton Sioux at the end of August 1804, the Yanktons were ready to open a trade relationship with the United States. The Yanktons had already entertained British and French traders and were aware that the world and their place in it was changing. Moreover, the tribe lacked firearms and ammunition, and many of its women and children were destitute. Yankton chiefs wanted to preserve their nation and believed that the Corps of Discovery could help make that possible. On the whole, the Yanktons' talk with Lewis and Clark were not particularly successful. The Yanktons wanted rifles, ammunition, and possibly whiskey from the Americans, but they were to get none of these. Instead, they received and accepted an invitation to send a delegation to Washington, D.C., where they might begin trade discussions with President Jefferson.
Next, the Teton Sioux hosted the adventurers. Through the expedition kept its keelboats anchored almost a mile away. During the stay, Clark made detailed notes of Teton culture. In his journal, the Tetons are described as thin, small, and generally ill-looking. A number of confrontations between the Tetons and the expedition brought the Americans' visit to an end. No one in the Corps of Discovery spoke Sioux, and the inability of the two groups to communicate effectively played a significant part in several misunderstandings. After another argument between the Tetons and the expeditions nearly escalated into fighting, Lewis and Clark continued upriver. From December 21, 1804 to April 6, 1805, the explorers stayed at Fort Mandan, North Dakota. The expedition members kept busy during the Fort Mandan winter, repairing equipment, trading with the Indians, and hunting for buffalo. Lewis and Clark learned much about the country to the west from the Mandan and their neighbors, the Hidatsa. Here they hired an interpreter, Toussaint Charbonneau, a French and Canadian fur trapper living among the Hidatsa. Charbonneau, his Shoshone wife Sacagawea, and their baby son Jean-Baptiste would travel with the expedition when it left Fort Mandan. On June 13th, Lewis became the first white man to see the Great Falls in the Missouri River. But to his astonishment, there were 5 separate falls, not one as the Indians had said, and they went on for a 12-mile stretch. Portaging around the falls was going to take much more time than he had planned. By June 16th, Lewis had rejoined Clark, and 6 days later, the portage began. It was the hardest physical task of the trip so far. More than a month would pass before the expedition was around the Great Falls and onto the next stretch of navigable water. Beyond rose the Rocky Mountains. The Shoshone traditionally traded with the Spanish, who would not give them guns or ammunition. The Indians were very clear that they wanted those guns so they could only compete with their regional enemies. Lewis was still holding out hope for a water passage to the Pacific, but Shoshone chief Kamaway explained that the only way westward was over the mountains that loomed in the distance. It was now imperative that the Corps secure horses. The Lemhi Shoshone were the tribe of Sacagawea. The woman hired with her husband Toussaint Charbonneau to guide the expedition and translate whenever necessary. Sacagawea, who had been kidnapped by raiding Hidatsa several years before, recognized Kamaway as her brother. After a joyful reunion, serious discussions between Lewis and Clark and the chief got underway. Negotiations for the horses were hindered by a cumbersome translation process. In Shoshone, Kamaway spoke to Sacagawea, who translated into Hidatsa for her husband Charbonneau. Charbonneau then passed the message along in French to Corpsman Francois Labiche, who repeated it in English for Lewis. This process repeated in reverse for any responses. Kamaway agreed to provide the horses the corps required and gave them information about the Nez Perce tribe they would encounter on the other side of the mountains. He also provided a guide, Old Toby, to lead them through the passes.
Game was scarce in the Rockies, and food supplies ran low. But finally the expedition reached the divide and passed over the other side, down into the Bitterroot Valley. There the Americans met a band of Flathead Indians and bought more horses for the journey across the Bitterroot Mountains. Crossing this range of the Rockies fully tested the expedition's endurance. After 11 days in the Bitterroots, the horses were near starvation. The men, who resorted to eating 3 of the colts, not much better. Emerging from the mountains, they made contact with the Nez Perce and procured from them dried fish and roots. In October 1805, using dugout canoes they learned to make from the Nez Perce, the expedition entered a section of the Columbia River that Clark called gut-swelling water, boiling and whirling in every direction. Convinced no one could make it through, Nez Perce Indians gathered on the banks to watch the white man drown. All expedition members made it through successfully.
On November 15, 1805, after months of journeying west, the Corps of Discovery finally viewed the Pacific Ocean near Chinook Point. Unfortunately, the explorers could not locate a suitable campsite because game in the area was scarce. Discussions with the Chinook revealed that game, particularly elk and edible roots, were more plentiful on the south bank of the Columbia River. A second alternative was to return upstream some distance on the Columbia. However, salt was scarce in that area and the climate was cooler. Lewis and Clark decided to let the entire party, including York and Sacagawea, vote on the location of the winter camp. Most African Americans and women could not vote in the United States in 1805, but this decision would affect everyone, and therefore Lewis and Clark felt York and Sacagawea also deserved a vote. The Corps decided to investigate the south side of the river and, if the game was plentiful, camp there. On November 25, 1805, the Corps of Discovery left their base camp near Chinook Point and traveled to the more favorable location of Fort Clatsop. During their winter at Fort Clatsop, the men had run out of tobacco. They had run out of whiskey the previous year, and morale was running low in the group. During the 3 months they spent at Fort Clatsop, Lewis and Clark reworked their journals and began preparing the scientific information they had gathered. Clark labored long hours drawing maps of the expedition. After talking with local Indians, the 2 men determined that they had taken an unnecessarily difficult path through the Rockies and planned alternate routes for the return journey. Meanwhile, the enlisted men and fellow travelers hunted and trapped. They killed and ate more than 100 elk and 20 deer during their stay. While the stay at Fort Clatsop was peaceful, it was not entirely pleasant. The Clatsop Indian tribe was friendly, but Clark noted that the Indians were hard bargainers, which caused the expedition party to rapidly deplete its supply of gifts and trading goods, and eventually caused some resentment on both sides. The worst part, though, was the damp coastal weather. Rain fell all but 12 days of the expedition's 3-month stay. The men found it impossible to keep dry, and their damp furs and hides rotted and became infested with vermin. Nearly everyone suffered from persistent colds. The expedition departed for home from soggy Clatsop on March 23, 1806. The region they explored later became the state of Oregon. Lewis and Clark's journey strengthened the American claim to the northwest and blazed a trail that was followed by thousands of trappers and settlers.
Having crossed the Bitterroots again, the expedition breaks into smaller groups in order to explore more of the Louisiana Territory. All of the parties are reunited downstream from the mouth of the Yellowstone River after months of exploration on August 12, 1806. On August 14th, the expedition returns to the Mandan village. Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and Jean-Baptiste stay there while the rest of the crew returns home. In September 1806, with the current of the Missouri River behind them, they are able to cover 70 miles per day. The expedition also begins meeting boats of American traders heading upriver. On September 23, 1806, the crew finally returned home to St. Louis, Missouri, where many people had assumed they had died. Lewis and Clark were treated as national heroes. They returned to Washington, D.C. The men received double pay and 320 acres of land as reward. The captains got 1,600 acres. Lewis was named governor of the Louisiana Territory. Clark was made Indian agent for the West and brigadier general of the territory's militia. This exploration set up the United States in their ultimate conquest for manifest destiny.